Blackstone Audiobooks presents Marx in 90 Minutes by Paul Strathern. Introduction. In 1848, the year that Karl Marx published the first Communist Manifesto, there were revolutionary disturbances throughout Europe, from Sicily to Warsaw. In Paris, the uprising led to the fall of the Orleans monarchy. In Vienna, the reactionary and repressive Chancellor Metternich was forced to flee in disguise, like a criminal. France and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were the two major powers on the continental mainland. It looked as if Europe was on the brink. But the forces of reaction eventually won the day, and their retribution was awesome. The scene in Dresden, described by Clara Schumann, wife of the composer, was typical. They shot down every insurgent they could find, and our landlady told us later that her brother, who owns the Golden Stag in Scheffelgasse, was made to stand and watch while the soldiers shot one after another 26 students they found in a room there. Then it is said they hurled men into the street by the dozen from the 3rd and 4th floors. It is horrible to have to go through these things. This is how men have to fight for their little bit of freedom. When will the time come when all men have equal rights? Marx proposed communism as the answer. The 20th century experience has taught us in no uncertain terms that it does not work. Yet several of Marx's most perceptive criticisms of capitalism remain unanswered. The questions of social justice which he raised, pressing and crucial at the time, remain with us. The cheek-by-jowl existence of luxury and pitiless destitution that can be found today in Bombay and Sao Paulo would be all too recognizable to the Marx who walked the streets of Dickensian London. Even in the heartlands of 21st century affluence created by capitalism, its contradictions are still evident in the urban ghettos of New York and Los Angeles, the economic wastelands of northeast England, and the slums of Naples. Capitalism has become the worldwide success story, but at a cost. In Marx's time, this cost was beginning to appear unbearable. Marx's life and works. Karl Marx was born in the German provincial city of Trier on May 5, 1818. Trier is just 6 miles from the Luxembourg border, on the Mosel River, which is renowned for its vineyards. Its proximity to the border and its love of wine make Trier an easy-going cosmopolitan spot, factors which were to have a significant influence on Marx. Like so many ardent revolutionaries, Marx was brought up amidst comfortable bourgeois surroundings. His father, Hirschel, was a successful local lawyer who also owned a couple of small vineyards, and one of Karl's uncles went on to found the Dutch industrial giant Philips. Although descended from a line of rabbis, Hirschel Marx was not religious. Like many German Jews during this period, such as the composer Felix Mendelssohn and the poet Heinrich Heine, he converted to Christianity. This was largely a formality, enabling him to assimilate more easily into German middle-class society. Hirschel, who now became Heinrich Marx, had already enthusiastically embraced European culture. His favorite authors were Kant and Voltaire, a characteristic blend of German profundity and French subversive wit. Germany was in the process of becoming a unified nation-state, and in 1815 the Rhineland provinces had been taken over by Prussia. The new Prussian rulers were deemed autocratic and oppressive by the more liberal locals. Karl's father joined a political club that pressed for the Prussian state to adopt a constitution which would enshrine the rights of its citizens. Few details of Karl's childhood have come down to us, apart from his so-called habit of forcing his sisters to eat mud pies. This sounds like a legend based upon a single incident: weeping, muddy-lipped girls, outraged mother, skulking Karl, etc. Needless to say, commentators have exploited its metaphorical implications to the full. This is what the mature Karl did to us all, and so forth. By the time he went to nearby Bonn University at the age of 18, Karl was already an avid imbiber of books and wine, dividing his time equally between the library and the taverns. During some riotous activity in the latter, he managed to provoke a local officer cadet into challenging him to a duel, and was lucky to emerge from this episode with nothing more serious than a traditional dueling scar. Karl was never the athletic type and even managed to evade military service on health grounds, aided by a somewhat suspect doctor's report. A year later, Marx transferred to the University of Berlin, ostensibly to continue his law studies, but by now he had discovered philosophy, and all else paled into insignificance. Berlin was the capital of Prussia, far from the wine-loving Rhineland, and here student life was a much more serious matter. And this was where the great Hegel had been professor of philosophy, becoming almost the official philosophical apologist for the Prussian state. But Hegel had died 5 years earlier, and a wide range of his followers had by now developed his ideas in a wide range of directions. Hegel's vast idealistic philosophical system had proved open to many contradictory interpretations, several of which were anything but sympathetic to the repressive Prussian state and all it stood for. Marx dutifully attended the official lectures on Hegel's philosophy, but claimed that he eventually fell ill from intense vexation at having to make an idol of a view I detested. Ironically, Hegel proved to be one of the main influences on Marx's philosophy. But it was the dynamics and scope of this philosophy, rather than its actual content, that appealed to Marx. Hegel's philosophy viewed the world and all history in terms of a vast, all-embracing, ever-evolving system. This evolution grew out of the struggle between contradictions and worked in a dialectical fashion. Each notion implied and generated the notion of its contradiction. For instance, the very notion of being implied the notion of non-being, or nothingness. These two opposites, the thesis and its antithesis, then came together to form their synthesis, which was becoming. In Hegel's all-embracing dialectical system, this synthesis then became a new thesis, which in its turn developed its own antithesis, and so on. This dynamic system moved through all ideas, all history, and all phenomena, up to the highest level of absolute spirit, reflecting upon itself, which is the totality of all that exists. More specifically, Hegel's philosophy of history insisted that the evolution of laws and government institutions in a society reflected the ethos and character of the people who made up that society. This may seem obvious to anyone who is used to living in a more liberal society, but it was far from obvious 150 years ago in the repressive, bureaucratic Prussian state. Hegel insisted that there was a dialectical link between the state and its citizens. This dialectic assumed both a logical and an organic aspect. The evolving structure of the state and the evolving traditions of its people were part and parcel of the same thing. Hegel's immensely prolix and complex philosophy appeared at an opportune historical moment. Its idealism, its insistence that all was moving toward the absolute spirit, filled the spiritual vacuum left by a growing disillusion with religion. It was Hegel who originally pronounced "God is dead" in 1827, not his firebrand successor Nietzsche, who is usually associated with this saying. Hegel was referring here to the more limited Christian idea of God, which would be superseded by the absolute spirit. Even so, his remark was highly blasphemous. Yet it was buried deep in the obfuscation of his all but unreadable work, and passed largely unnoticed. As a result, his philosophy appeared essentially conservative to the Prussian authorities. Its emphasis on a vast hierarchical system seemed like the absolute dream of a bureaucratic state. It was Hegel's insistence on the spiritual, his religiosity, and the repressive conservatism of his system that made Marx sick. Another major influence on Marx's intellectual development at this juncture was the German humanist philosopher and moralist Ludwig Fireback, who was born in 1801 and had originally studied theology. In his early 20s, Feuerbach had abandoned theology in favor of studying under Hegel in Berlin. But by the time Feuerbach published his major works, he had progressed far beyond the orthodox theology and orthodox Hegelianism of his earlier years. According to Feuerbach, Christianity had nothing to do with humanity's relation to God. This religion, like all religions, covertly involved the relation between humanity and its own essential nature. The attributes of God were nothing more or less than the projected attributes of humanity. Our so-called knowledge of God was in fact no more than knowledge about ourselves and our own nature. For Hegel, the pinnacle of his system had been God, in the form of absolute spirit reflecting upon itself. Fireback accepted this structure, and even its dynamic, but interpreted it from a humanistic viewpoint. Absolute spirit reflecting upon itself was nothing more or less than humanity's own self-consciousness, man's consciousness of his own essential nature, his understanding of his substantive self.